Today, boys and girls, we're going to be working on lesson 7.9, collecting and using fractional data. Our essential question for today is, how can I show fractional data on a number line? For today's mental math and fluency, you will be multiplying fractions. Remember the rule for multiplying fractions. First, you multiply the numerators, and then you multiply the denominators. Try changing any improper fractions, which are our OO fractions, where the numerator is larger than the denominator, to mixed numbers. On the next slide, you'll be able to check your work. Here are the answers to the mental math and fluency. Please take a minute to pause the video to check your work. For the math message, you will be reading about natural measures and standard units in your SRB on page 212. You can read the information in your SRB or read it directly in this video. Please pause the video at this time to read page 212 in your SRB. After reading page 212 in your student reference book, you probably have a little bit of a better understanding about natural measures and standard units. So today we're going to be talking about how can we measure the fathom, the cubit, the great span, and joint to find the most precise or the most accurate measurement. So when we're looking at the fathom, would measuring fathoms to the nearest yard give a precise measurement? Why or why not? The answer would be no. A yard is much too large to be measuring the fathom to get a precise measurement. Would measuring fathoms to the nearest foot give a precise measurement? Why or why not? Again, the answer would be no, because it wouldn't give the most precise measurement. You would probably want to go even smaller and use the inch. The cubit, great span, and joint are a shorter length than the fathom. Does it make sense to use a more precise or less precise unit of measure? Why? The answer would be more precise because you want to be even more specific about the measurement of the cubit, the great span, and the joint, since they are smaller than the fathom. In most cases, there may be several appropriate measurement units, but for today's lesson, the entire class will use the same unit of measure. We will be measuring to the nearest inch, the nearest half inch, the nearest quarter inch, and the nearest eighth of an inch. I've included a ruler just as a point of reference, so please look at the first arrow that points to the nearest inch. Then look at the next arrow that points to the nearest half inch. The next arrow points to the nearest quarter inch, and the last arrow points to the nearest eighth inch. As you can see, it gets more specific the smaller the inch tick marks become. So if we were to get into pairs and measure each other's fathoms, cubits, great spans, and joints, we would measure them to the nearest inch, half inch, quarter inch, and eighth of an inch. But for today's lesson, I'm going to give you the measurements that you will be able to record in your math journal. At this time, please turn to page 258 in your math journal. For number 1, it actually asks you to find your own personal measurements. We will not be doing that today, as I will be providing you with measurements to complete the line plot. First, we will be starting with the cubit lengths, which would have been measured to the nearest half inch. You can see at the bottom I have provided you with data for 23 different cubit lengths. Remember, when you create a line plot, you will be going from least on the left to greatest. So make sure that you order your cubit lengths from least to greatest. Remember, when creating a line plot, you will be using X's for each piece of data that occurs in the set below. At this time, you'll need to pause the video in order to create your line plot for cubit lengths on page 258 in your math journal. Make sure that when you're finished your line plot that you have 23 pieces of data. Now turn to page 259 in your math journal. You will be doing the same activity as you just did with the cubit lengths for the great span lengths. You'll be creating a line plot, and remember, great span lengths were measured to the nearest quarter inch. So if I look at my set of data, I find that 4.5 is my smallest piece of data in this set. And if I go through my set, I find 1, 2, 3 pieces of data that are 4.5. So above the 4.5, I will put 3 X's. Next, you need to make sure, because we're measuring to the nearest 1/4 inch, that instead of jumping from 4.5 to 5, the next 1/4 inch would actually be 4 3/4. So you would need to label it 4 3/4. And if I look at my set of data, it looks like I only have one piece of data that's 4 3/4. So remember, you're going to be measuring and listing again from least to greatest and putting X's above each time that piece of data occurs in the set below. So please complete the great span length line plot on page 259 in your math journal. You may pause the video in order to copy down all 23 pieces of data. Continuing with the activity on page 259 in your math journal, you're now going to use the measurements below to create a line plot for joint lengths. Just remember that joint lengths were measured to the nearest 1/8 of an inch. So the very first joint length that you will find, the smallest one in this set of data, would be 3/8 of an inch. So you would label the first tick mark 3/8, and if you look through your set of data, there is only one 3/8. You're going to continue with the next piece of data, which would be 4/8, which is actually the same thing as 1/2. Remember, when you see the number 1, that's the same thing as 8/8. Again, you have 23 pieces of data. Make sure that you have all pieces of data accounted for on your line plot. So you're going to need to pause the video in order to copy this down on page 259 in your math journal and create the line plot for joint lengths. Now that we've finished our 3 line plots, you will be using the information just from page 259 on great span lengths and joint lengths to answer questions 6 through 8. So look at question 6. It says use the evening out strategy to find a typical measurement for your class. And remember, when we're talking about class, you're using the data that I provided you. So when we're talking about a typical measurement, if you recall, we found different ways to find the typical measurement. You could choose the number that came up the most, you could choose the number in the middle, or you could use the evening out strategy, which has you add the numbers and then divide by the total number of data points. For this activity, it is asking you to use the evening out strategy, okay? And it even has the remember here, and it tells you that to even it out, you have to add all the values and then divide the total by the number of data points. So they want you to do this for the great span length and the joint data, which were both found on your line plots on page 259. Remember, there are 23 pieces of data, so you need to add all pieces of data together, and then you will be dividing by 23, since there are 23 pieces of data. You may use a calculator, okay, because this has a lot of addition of numbers with fractions, so you absolutely may use a calculator. Question 7 says, how much longer is the typical great span than the typical joint? So you need to, when you found out the answer to number 6, you need to do how much longer is the typical great span than the typical joint. So you need to have a number model, and then you need to have your answer. So remember, when it's asking how much longer something is, think about what operation you need to do. And for number 8, it says if everyone in your class had the typical great span measurement, so the typical great span measurement, which you found right there in number 6A. And you all lined up one of your hands, thumb to pinky. What would be the total distance? Okay, so remember, for our data, we had 23 pieces of data. So you're going to need to use that number plus whatever answer you got for 6A to figure out the number model and then the answer. Think about what operation you would need to do when you get the great span data for 6A, the typical measurement, and 23 people in the class. At this time, you're going to need to pause your video in order to finish completing page 259 in your math journal.